Before we begin, take a breath. This story isn't easy to hear, because it could have happened to someone you know. A daughter, a mother, a moment where love turns cold, and silence says everything. This is what happens when someone you trust most decides you're no longer worth the cost. Not the emotional toll, not the time, not even the space in their car. And if this story moves you, if it reminds you of something you've buried deep, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to their family stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because someone out there needs to know they're not alone. Now, let me tell you how my mother left me in a hospital parking lot. And why that day, though it nearly broke me, became the beginning of everything. My mother left me in a hospital parking lot, saying I was too expensive to keep alive. She didn't whisper it, she didn't cry, she didn't even look at me. She said it while putting the car in park, hands loose on the wheel like she was waiting for takeout. "You're 36, Isabel," she muttered, eyes fixed ahead. "I've done more than enough. I can't afford to keep playing nursemaid." Then she got out, walked around, opened my door, and placed my purse in my lap like I was a stranger she'd found unconscious. And just like that, she was gone. Her tires crunched over gravel as she pulled away from the emergency bay. I remember the heat from the pavement pressing through my thin sneakers. The hospital's automatic doors hissing open behind me as people walked in and out, not even glancing my way. I wanted to believe it was a joke, that she'd circle the lot, cool off, come back. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, and still, nothing. I leaned against the concrete column, fingers curled around the medication sample bag they'd given me inside. My chest hurt, my vision blurred, but worse than the physical pain was the realization sinking like a stone. She wasn't coming back. This was the woman who once sat beside me every night when I was 5 and sick with pneumonia. Who taught me how to separate whites from colors on laundry day. Who once told me I was her tiny miracle. But those memories were old, faded, like clothes that had been washed too many times. Now I was inconvenient. I was a bill she didn't want to pay. Growing up, I thought love meant sacrifice. That if I didn't complain, if I smiled through the pain, I'd be easier to keep. That if I made myself small enough, she'd keep me close. But that day, I wasn't a daughter, I was an expense. And the most haunting part? I wasn't even surprised. There had been signs, subtle shifts. The way her voice would tighten every time I had a flare-up. The way she sighed when I asked for rides to appointments. How she'd complain about the bills but never show me the actual numbers. And yet I stayed quiet, loyal, grateful, because I thought that's what daughters did. But now, sitting on a curb outside the with my body aching and my pride in ruins, I realized something she never wanted me to know. Love without respect isn't love. It's control. And I was finally, painfully, being released from hers. What she didn't know, what she never imagined, was that I'd survive. And I'd uncover everything she worked so hard to hide. She didn't always used to be that way. There were days, years, even, when I thought my mother truly loved me. Not just tolerated me, or managed me, or endured me, but loved me. I remember her warm hands tying my scarf before school, her voice humming along to the radio as she cooked canned soup on cold nights. We didn't have much, but I didn't feel poor. Not back then. Judith Grant was the kind of woman people described as sharp. Not affectionate, not soft, but respected. She was always put together, hair sprayed stiff, nails done at home every other Sunday, lipstick perfectly traced even on grocery runs. And she taught me early that the world didn't give handouts. That you either worked hard, or you were a burden. I tried not to be a burden. The first time I got sick, I was 9. I remember the fever that wouldn't break, the strange ache in my joints, how my hands swelled like little balloons. They thought it was juvenile arthritis at first, but test after test led us nowhere. What it turned out to be was something rare, difficult to manage, and worst of all, expensive. My mother never cried at the diagnosis. Not once. She asked the doctor, flatly, "So how much will this cost?" And from that moment on, I was her walking invoice. She kept a little notebook, treatments, co-pays, prescriptions, Even gas money to and from the hospital. Once, when I asked if we could stop for ice cream after an appointment, she opened it and showed me a page. June total, $742. Then she closed the book and said nothing. I learned to stop asking. But I found something else. Something that didn't cost her a thing. I started drawing in waiting rooms. First with crayons on the back of appointment cards. Then with pens I'd sneak from the front desk. I sketched nurses, other kids, the tangle of IV tubes. I made up stories for them. Sometimes they were superheroes. Sometimes they were birds, flying far away from the white walls and beeping machines. Drawing became my medicine. By the time I was 17, I knew I wanted to illustrate children's books. The kind that might have made those long days in the hospital feel less lonely. I even got into a small art program in Philadelphia. A counselor helped me apply for scholarships. I was ready. But when the acceptance letter came, my mother didn't smile. "There's no money," she said, "unless you want to rack up debt for a hobby. You'll stay home." I nodded. Like always, I took local freelance jobs instead, logos for bakeries, flyers for daycare centers, and she let me stay rent-free, so long as I didn't get any ideas. I think she liked having me dependent. She could complain about how much I needed her, but deep down, she needed to be needed. It was quiet manipulation, smothering wrapped in sacrifice. Years passed. My body hurt more. The flares came harder and stayed longer. But I never pushed back. Not when she rolled her eyes at the sight of my pill organizer. Not when she sighed as she filled out insurance forms. Not even when I overheard her tell a neighbor, if I didn't have to care for Isabel, maybe I'd finally take that trip to Italy. I just smiled. Drew. Got by. But all the while, something inside me started to shift. I didn't have a name for it then. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like erosion. The slow wear of never being allowed to take up space. I was a woman approaching 40. Still asking for rides to the pharmacy. Still shrinking myself to keep the peace. And I was tired. So I began to dream again, quietly. I reopened my old sketches. I outlined a story about a brave little girl who lived in a hospital, befriending the shadows on the wall. It wasn't just a story. It was my way out. I told myself if I could finish the manuscript, get it published, maybe, just maybe, I could build a life that didn't orbit around her. But dreams require time, energy, money, and those were things Judith controlled with a firm grip. Still, I worked in secret, and for a while, I let hope live in the pages of that book. Until the day my body failed me again, more violently than ever before. And this time, she wasn't even pretending to care. It started with a numbness in my fingers. I'd been working at the kitchen table, trying to finish a spread for the book, one with a girl in a faded blue gown reaching toward the stars outside her hospital window. My hand cramped, then froze. The pencil dropped. By the time I stood, my knees buckled. Pain shot through my ribs like someone had tied barbed wire around my lungs and pulled tight. I collapsed. Judith was upstairs, folding laundry. When she finally came down and saw me on the floor, she didn't gasp or panic. She just stood in the doorway, arms crossed, mouth tight. "You should have said something sooner," she muttered, already reaching for her keys. "You know how I hate emergencies." She drove me to the in silence, only speaking to scold me for not bringing my insurance card. I could barely hold my head up. And she was lecturing me like I'd forgotten a library book. The hospital took me in quickly. The doctors suspected a severe autoimmune flare, internal inflammation, dehydration, possible infection. They needed to admit me, run tests, hook up fluids, monitor vitals. When the nurse stepped out to call for a bed, my mother shifted in her seat. She looked at me, not with concern, but calculation. "Do they have to admit you?" she asked. Her voice low. "Is there a cheaper way to handle this?" I blinked. My lips were cracked. I couldn't even sit upright. Then came the words I should have expected but still wasn't ready for. "I can't keep doing this. Isabel," she said, "I've spent 30 years dragging your health problems behind me like a ball and chain. You think that's fair?" She reached into her purse, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and shoved it toward me. It was a copy of a hospital bill from 2 years ago. $6,000, she said. For what? Another episode you barely remember? I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words got lost somewhere between my throat and the dry air. She stood, looked around the small exam room like it offended her. Then she picked up my things, the bag of prescriptions, my phone, and stuffed them into my lap. They haven't started paperwork yet. You'll figure it out. You always do. I think she believed that was kindness. She wheeled me down the hall in silence, said goodbye to the nurse at the front desk, then steered me toward the exit like she was dropping off a package. Outside, the sun hit hard. I remember how the heat shimmered off the blacktop, how distant the ambulance sirens sounded. I slumped against the building while she walked back to the car. Just before she opened the door, she turned. "Don't call me unless it's a real emergency," she said, and even then, think twice. Then she drove off, and I sat there, 36 years old, sick, alone, and completely discarded. But here's the thing about being thrown away: you land somewhere. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being without her. I was afraid of what I might find out on my own. Because deep down, I'd always suspected she was hiding something. Not just resentment, but secrets, money, maybe, or help she never accepted. The way she never let me see medical mail. How she took over every insurance form. Insisted she'd handle everything. She made me feel like a burden so I'd never question the weight. And maybe now, without her, I'd finally be free to lift it. A security guard found me still slumped outside the doors. Maybe 20 minutes after my mother drove away. He must have thought I was disoriented or high. People make all kinds of assumptions when they see a grown woman collapsed in public. I could barely lift my head. But I remember how gently he spoke. Not like I was broken, but like I was worth helping. He flagged down a nurse. They brought me back inside. This time without asking who'd brought me in. I was admitted under emergency care. Fluids, steroids, labs. For a while, I drifted in and out of sleep. I remember white ceilings, beeping machines, and quiet footsteps. I remember feeling safer without her there. On the third day, once I could sit up and sip water without vomiting, a woman came into the room. She was wearing a navy blazer. Her ID clipped to the lapel. Her name was Alana, a hospital social worker. She pulled up a chair, opened a folder, and gave me a look I didn't recognize, soft, but knowing. "We met," she said, "a long time ago. You probably don't remember." I squinted. She smiled faintly. "I was here, as a kid, in and out for 2 years. You used to draw pictures for me in the waiting room." Gave me one of a giraffe in a hospital gown. It came back like a photograph rising through water. A pale girl with a scar on her scalp. Wide eyes, soft voice. I remembered drawing animals for her, anything to distract her from her own fear. Alana leaned forward. "I always remembered you, Isabel. You were kind when no one else was. And now it's my turn." I didn't know what to say. I stared at my hands. She reached into the folder, pulled out a printout. "I looked up your medical coverage and saw some unusual records. Payments, grants, things that should have gone to you. But the accounts list your mother as the contact. All of them." My stomach twisted. "I don't want to overwhelm you," she said gently, "but I think it's time you saw what's been going on." The documents showed fund transfers from a patient advocacy group I'd never heard of. Charity grants, transportation reimbursements, even a pharmaceutical settlement. All of it listed under my name, but with my mother's bank account attached. One transfer was dated 4 years ago, $40,000 from a legal class action settlement involving a drug I'd taken as a teenager. I had no idea there'd even been a lawsuit. Alana paused. This is financial exploitation." I shook my head, not out of disbelief, but something stranger. Recognition. I'd always felt the chill of it, like a draft in a closed room. But seeing the numbers spelled out like that, it took the air from my lungs. All those years I'd believed her. When she said there was no money. When she said I was draining her. When she waved off my dreams like they were too expensive to indulge. It was never poverty. It was control. And I let her have it. Because I thought I owed her something I could never repay. Alana gave me a moment. Then she said, "We can help you take steps. Recover some of this. Protect yourself going forward. But it's up to you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared out the window, watching headlights blur across the parking lot below. I thought about all the birthdays I'd spent under that roof. All the times I'd drawn little cards for Judith, thanking her for sacrificing so much. I thought about the book I hadn't finished, the life I hadn't started. And I thought about the lie I'd been told for so long, that I was too weak to stand on my own. The next morning, I signed the papers. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine, not just the money, but the truth. And once I had the truth, there was no going back. The paperwork took weeks to process. I stayed in the hospital for 6 more days, recovering slowly, both in body and in something deeper, something I didn't have a name for yet. I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. Not the enforced kind that comes with illness, but the quieter, more dangerous kind. Reflection. Judith didn't visit. Not once. Not even a call. I wasn't surprised. The staff arranged for me to be released into temporary housing through a medical recovery program. It wasn't glamorous. A studio apartment above a pharmacy. A borrowed wheelchair. A fridge stocked with basics, but it was mine. It was the first place I'd ever lived that wasn't under her roof. That first night, I sat by the small window, holding a cup of weak tea, listening to the distant hum of traffic. It was the freest I'd felt in my life. Alana visited often. She helped me contact the legal aid office, connect with the fund administrators, and eventually gain access to the records Judith had kept hidden. The more we uncovered, the worse it got. Judith had been receiving monthly caregiver stipends for over 10 years. She'd used my illness as justification, sending in fake reports, staging receipts, even submitting photographs of pill bottles and mobility aids I'd never seen. One form listed me as permanently homebound. All the while, she told me we couldn't afford better medication, that insurance had denied coverage again, that the clinic was full, that we had to wait it out. It was a carefully crafted reality, one where I depended on her. And she controlled every part of my care. I remember sitting with those papers spread out in front of me, a highlighter in one hand, a lump in my throat. I felt like I was reading a biography of someone else. But it was me. Every page marked a moment I'd swallowed pain and smiled through it. Every check she'd cashed was a chance she took from me. And still, part of me searched for some explanation. Some story I could cling to where she wasn't the villain. Where maybe she was scared. Or tired. Or just desperate. I wanted so badly to believe she had loved me. Even if it had been twisted and imperfect. But love doesn't steal from you. It doesn't discard you outside a hospital. One morning, Alana brought over a letter. Legal aid had helped file a formal report against Judith for financial fraud and elder medical abuse. She would be notified, contacted, investigated. I didn't know what that would mean for her. Or for me. The thought made my stomach turn. But I signed the letter anyway. A few days later, I received a check, partial restitution from one of the foundations Judith had siphoned funds from. It was more money than I'd seen in my adult life. Enough to cover my treatment, get my own insurance, and, maybe, print my book. I sat with that check in my hand for a long time. The old me would have called her, told her we didn't need to fight, offered to split it, just to keep the peace. But I didn't call. Instead, I opened my sketchbook. The girl in the blue gown was still there, reaching toward a window. I gave her stars this time. Then a moon. Then a bird, waiting on the windowsill. I gave her an open door. And then I gave her my name. It felt like breathing for the first time. I didn't know what was going to happen to Judith. But I knew what was going to happen to me. I was going to live. Not just survive. Not just scrape by in the corners of her life. I was going to live fully. With truth. And light. And room to stretch. She'd tried to leave me behind like trash. But the truth was, she'd set me free. And now, I was finally strong enough to walk away. The first time I stood without help. It was just to reach a teacup. There was nothing dramatic about it. No music swelling. No audience clapping. Just me, in a thin robe, barefoot on cold linoleum, wobbling my way to the cupboard in the early morning light. But something about that moment stayed with me. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to hand me what I needed. I was reaching for it myself. The check from the foundation gave me enough to get settled. I found a modest apartment above a bookstore, tiny, but with warm walls and a window that let in real sun. The kind of place where I could hear the pipes knock and the neighbors argue. And it still felt like sanctuary. I bought a desk, a real one, set up my paints, opened the folder that held my draft manuscript, wrinkled, half-finished pages with doodles in the margins and notes scrawled in tired handwriting. And I got to work. I'd always thought I needed a clean life to write something beautiful. I was wrong. What I needed was space. And honesty. And silence from all the voices that had told me I wasn't enough. Every day, I drew a little more. Wrote a little more. The book grew slowly, like something blooming in an abandoned lot. Wild, messy, determined. Meanwhile, word came down that the investigation into Judith was moving forward. She'd been formally served. They called it misappropriation of care funds. I didn't need the legal jargon. I knew what it was. Stealing. A neighbor of hers, someone who'd always waved but never asked questions, sent me a message on Facebook. She'd seen the officials at the house. Said Judith looked stunned, pale, like she couldn't believe someone had dared to hold her accountable. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Let her sit in that silence. Let her finally feel what it was like to be left without explanation. I think people like her count on you staying quiet. On you being too ashamed. Too scared. Too grateful to speak up. They don't expect you to survive. They certainly don't expect you to fight back. But I wasn't the same girl she dropped off at that hospital. The book was finished by the time the first settlement was finalized. I sent it out with trembling hands. Expecting nothing. A small independent publisher in Vermont wrote back 2 weeks later. They loved it. They wanted it. They said it reminded them of the books they grew up with. The ones that made them feel seen. The day the first box of printed copies arrived, I sat on the floor, opened the lid, and cried until my face hurt. There she was on the cover, the girl in the blue gown. Standing tall in a field of stars. And underneath her, my name, not Judith's. Not someone else's. Mine. I dedicated the book to the children who suffer silently. And then I mailed the first copy to the hospital. To the pediatric waiting room. I imagined it in the hands of some tired kid. Curled up in a chair. Waiting for a diagnosis. Wondering if they mattered. I hoped they'd see themselves in those pages. I hoped they'd feel just a little less invisible. I never heard from Judith again. Not directly. But a few months later. I got a legal notice. She tried to contest the charges. Claimed I forged the documents. Said I was mentally unstable. Ungrateful. Manipulative. It didn't hold up. The evidence was too strong. The money trail too clear. She was fined. Ordered to return what she could. Publicly reprimanded. The last line of the court record read, "The victim is no longer under the respondent's care." And that was it. That one sentence felt like a lifetime unlocked. I folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and made myself a cup of tea. There was no celebration, no confrontation, just quiet, the kind that only comes after years of noise. Judith had tried to define me through dependence, through guilt, through shame, but I'd reclaimed my story, and written a new ending. And now, for the first time, I was living in it. Some mornings I still wake up expecting to hear her footsteps in the hallway. It's muscle memory, I suppose. All those years of quiet listening, trying to gauge her mood by the way she set down her coffee mug. Or how sharply she closed a drawer. I used to hold my breath when the floor creaked. Now I breathe through it. My life has settled into something simple, steady, and that's new for me. I make tea at the same time each morning. I water the little basil plant on the windowsill, though it's always threatening to wilt. I reply to letters from children who've read my book, some of them sick. Some of them just lonely. Their drawings arrive folded in crayon-covered envelopes. I keep every single one. The book did better than I ever imagined. It didn't become a bestseller or get featured on television. But it found its way. Teachers reached out. Therapists. Parents who said, "This helped my daughter understand her brother's illness." Or, "My son saw himself for the first time." That was more than enough. One letter came from a woman in her 60s. She'd been caring for her mother for over a decade, quietly enduring the same emotional strain I knew too well. She said she never saw her experience in a children's story before, but there, tucked in the space between illustrations, she found pieces of herself. And she wept. That's when I realized something. This story was never just mine. It belonged to anyone who's ever been used, silenced, abandoned, and still kept going. There's a little bench by the river near my apartment. I walk there some evenings when the air cools. I bring a blanket and watch the sun fold itself into the water. One night, not long ago, I brought a copy of the book. I placed it on the bench, wrapped in plastic to keep the dew out, with a note tucked inside, for someone who needs to feel seen. Then I walked away. I don't know who found it. I hope they kept it. Judith's name comes up now only in paperwork. The settlement reached its final phase. The court ruled that I would receive a structured portion of the recovered funds across several years. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle, that someone had finally said, in ink and signature, "You were wronged," and it mattered. I think part of me always hoped she'd apologize. That one day, I'd get a letter, maybe not full of warmth, but something. I didn't know better. I was scared. "I'm sorry." But nothing came. And over time, I stopped waiting. Some people never face what they've done. They live inside the version of the story where they're always the martyr. Always the one left carrying the weight. But I no longer have to carry that version with me. One afternoon, I visited the hospital, not for myself, but for a reading event in the pediatric wing. The same hallway where I'd once drawn pictures on the backs of brochures now held bright murals and bookshelves. A nurse introduced me. I read to a small group of children with IV poles and tired parents. One little girl curled up beside me, silent the whole time, her hand brushing against mine. When I finished, she looked up and whispered, "Did this really happen to you?" I nodded. She didn't say anything more, just rested her head on my arm, like she understood. That moment, small, soft, without fanfare, meant more than any courtroom ruling ever could. Because I wasn't just healing. I was helping others begin. And maybe that's the only real justice, choosing to build something gentle from everything that tried to break you. I go to sleep most nights with the window cracked open. The air smells like pine and rain. I no longer brace myself for what's coming. I no longer measure my worth by anyone else's ledger. I was never the burden. I was the blessing. And when my mother left me in that parking lot, she didn't abandon me. She released me. That's when my real life finally began.